of the church. You may remember that Oscar Romero was bishop in El Salvador when he was assassinated in 1981. He knew from a very young age that he wanted to be a priest. He went to seminary and was ordained in the early 40s. He served a number of churches in El Salvador. He was appointed a bishop in 1970 and then appointed archbishop of the whole country in 1977. When he was appointed archbishop, the government of the day was pleased because Oscar Romero had a reputation for being very conservative. He was pretty conservative theologically. He was a member of Opus Dei, a conservative Catholic movement within the church. He was viewed by the church hierarchy as a relatively conservative bishop. In particular, he did not subscribe to the prevailing theological view in Central America at the time, which was liberation theology. Liberation theology is sort of a combination of a Marxist political worldview along with an understanding that God has a preference for the poor, that God particularly pays attention to the needs and concerns of the poor. And Romero had problems with the political part of that, and so he did not follow liberation theology, which made him unusual at the time. So the kind of right-leaning government of El Salvador was pleased when he was appointed archbishop. But as he began to serve as archbishop, he became concerned about the way the government treated dissidents and about the way the government was treating poor people. And more of his ministry was focused on ministering with the poor and speaking out against the repression of dissent in the country by the right-wing government. He eventually then subscribed to liberation theology, properly formulated as he put it. He became one of the more liberal, one of the more left-leaning archbishops in the Roman Church. And for his efforts, he was ultimately assassinated while celebrating Mass in 1981 by a militia movement associated with the government of the day. His funeral attracted about 250,000 people, an enormous event. And the question on many of the attendees' minds was, how could something so awful happen to someone so good, to someone who had spent their entire life trying to follow God as best as he could, had spent his entire life serving the church, had even late in life rethought his deeply held religious convictions, and come to a new understanding of how God was calling him to live. How could God allow something so evil to happen to someone so good? It is that question that underlays the entire book of Job that we've been reading the last couple of weeks and will continue the next couple of weeks. Last week we heard the prologue to the book of Job, the kind of story. Job is a righteous man, righteous in the sight of the Lord, does everything right, does nothing wrong, and he has been richly rewarded by God. He has a large family, he has great wealth, he has many possessions. And because Satan goes and challenges God and says to God, of course Job praises your name, you have given him everything. Take everything away from him and he will curse you to your face. God agrees, everything is taken away from Job, his family dies, all his possessions and wealth are wiped out, and he is afflicted with sores from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. At the end of chapter 2 of the book of Job, we see him sitting outside the city gates in a pile of ashes, scraping his sores with a bit of pottery. At the beginning of chapter 3, three of Job's friends show up. And there's a good lesson here for any of us who ever go visit someone in the hospital or are trying to be a good friend to someone who is experiencing some kind of trauma. The first thing his friends do is spot on, and I recommend it to you. His friends sit there and say nothing for 7 days. You do not have to go to the hospital and have the right thing to say. Just being there with your friend in a time of need is enough. They get that right for 7 days. Unfortunately, then, they get it so wrong because they start talking. And they start telling Job that the reason he is suffering so much is because he must have done something wrong. they're having this sort of conversation with Job. One of them will say something, and then Job will respond, and then another one will say something, and Job will respond again, and the third one will say something. It goes back and forth over and over again from chapter 3 through chapter 37. And his friends, everything his friends say is a variation of, you must have done something wrong. Think, what was it? Identify that, ask for forgiveness, and all of your sorrow will go away. God will restore you. And at every juncture, when they say that, Job argues back and says, no, I am innocent. I have done nothing wrong. I have not sinned either physically, I have not sinned in my heart, I have not sinned in my mind. I am blameless. This has happened to me for some other reason. And his friends again will say, no, you must have done something. Something that you must have earned this somehow. Just figure out what it was and ask for forgiveness. Job finally stops paying much attention to what they're saying, but he's trying to work out then why he thinks he is suffering. He accepts his friend's basic thesis that God sends bad things to happen to bad people to teach them a lesson. But in his case, he is not a bad person. He did nothing wrong. So what could this possibly be? In addition, Job notices as he looks out at the world, that it seems to him there are an awful lot of bad people wandering around who have been blessed richly, that bad things don't seem to happen to. So he's trying to figure out what that means, and he comes up with an idea. He wishes that there were some kind of arbiter, a neutral judge, that he could go to and make his case, point out that he is innocent, and then the arbiter would determine that indeed he is innocent, and then God would be forced to restore him to health, restore his fortunes. But no sooner does he get that out of his mouth than he realizes that he has violated God's omnipotence. He's suggested that somehow God is not in control of the universe. And so he apologizes, he takes that back, he praises God's name, and then one of his friends chimes in again to say, you must have done something wrong, just ask for forgiveness. The next go around, Job says, well, if only I could speak directly to God and make my case, God would see that somehow a mistake has been made, and everything will be fine. And he begins to cry out for God's presence. He begins to cry out to God to listen to him, and that's where our passage this morning comes from. Job says, I go forward looking for you and you're not there. I go backwards looking for you, you're not there. I go to the left, I go to the right, you're not there. You remain silent. Where are you, God, so I can plead my case? And there is no response from God. These are hard questions that Job asked, and they're hard questions that theologians, Jewish and Christian theologians, have struggled with over the centuries. And the reason that the question of why do bad things happen to good people is so difficult is because theologians try and hold in balance two ideas about God. One, that God is righteous and just and fair. And the other idea is that God is in control of the universe. That God is omnipotent. That there is nothing that God can't do. But the problem of trying to hold both of those together is that we're still stuck with why it is that bad things happen to good people. Because if God is fair, then bad things can't happen to good people. And if God is not able to stop bad things from happening, then God is not in control of the universe. As it happens, in 1981, the same year that Oscar Romero was assassinated, Rabbi Harold Kushner published his book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? And he wrote that book out of his experience of having to watch his young son, who was born with a genetic disorder, suffer and die at age 14. It was, as you can imagine, a horrific experience for him and his wife. And he asked the question that anyone would, why is God letting this happen? And he writes in his book that he comes to an understanding that God travels with us in suffering. He does not abandon us in suffering. God is with us when the chips are down. But that somehow God is not able to prevent all suffering. There are things that God is not able to control. The book was pretty popular. I don't know if you remember in the 80s, it was widely read. It was widely attacked, roundly attacked by conservative Jewish and conservative Christian theologians because it violated God's omnipotence. It suggested that God was not in control of creation. I don't really know exactly where I come down on this very difficult question, but I know a couple things. One, I agree with Rabbi Kushner that God does not abandon us in suffering. And I see that because I've observed it time and time again. And because it seems to me it is imprinted in our Christian story. In the person of Jesus, God suffered the worst that this life has to offer. Jesus was betrayed and abandoned by his friends. He was accused of crimes he didn't commit, convicted of crimes he didn't commit, brutally tortured, and horribly crucified. God experienced the very worst that this world has to offer, up to and including death. God is with us in times of suffering. I'm not ready, however, to go with Rabbi Kushner and suggest that God is not in control of the universe. I'm more inclined to think that God is in control of things. And that is really a statement of faith. It is not based on observation. Any rational look at the world would maybe suggest that God isn't really in control. But I have faith that God is. It's just that we're not perhaps able to see the whole design of God's creation, the reasons for suffering and horror in the world. It's maybe not a perfectly satisfying answer, but it is at the core of my faith that God is in control of creation. I think that is the good news for us today, that God is with us in times of suffering, that we are not abandoned, and that God is omnipotent, that God is in control of the universe, and that is the foundation of our faith. I pray that we'll remember that today and always. Amen.